My name is Ruth Calloway. I'm 60 years old, and I've run the public library in a little town called Hollow Creek, Tennessee, for going on 22 years. It's the kind of building where the radiator clanks like it's got opinions, where the same 6 retirees claim the same 6 armchairs every single morning, and where I know exactly which kid is going to ask for the dinosaur books before they've even said hello. People don't think much of a library job, but I've learned there's a particular kind of peace in a room built entirely around things that don't change. The Dewey Decimal System doesn't care what kind of year you've had. The evening this story starts, a man sat down across from me at a diner outside of town, looked at the napkin in his lap instead of at me, and apologized for not being what I was hoping for. And what I said back made that man go quiet for almost a full minute before he could speak again. To understand why, you'd have to understand that I was the last woman in 3 counties who had any business hoping for anything. It was a setup. My sister-in-law Dot, who runs the diner where it happened and has appointed herself the unofficial mayor of everyone's love life, arranged the whole thing without asking me twice. She'd been circling the idea for over a year, ever since I told her I'd closed that particular book for good. "You're not retired from living, Ruth," she liked to say. "You just act like you are." She wore me down with pot roast and persistence until one Wednesday evening, I found myself in a vinyl booth at Dot's Corner Diner, in a cardigan I'd picked out 3 times and changed twice, waiting on a man named Sam that I had never once laid eyes on. When he walked in, a little early, a little awkward in the doorway, he slid into the booth across from me, and before he said a word of greeting, he looked down at the napkin he was folding into smaller and smaller squares and said, quiet, like he'd rehearsed it in his truck on the way over, "I'm sorry I'm not what you were hoping for. Dot probably talked me up. I'm just a 63-year-old retired fire captain with a bad knee and more funerals behind me than I care to count. If you want to call this short, I understand. I won't take it personal." Before I tell you what I said back to him, the thing that made him go quiet, I want to ask you something. If you've ever sat across from your own life and felt like you'd already read the last page, like there wasn't another chapter left worth turning to, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because this story is for you, and I promise you it's going somewhere worth staying for. Let me back up, though, because none of this lands right unless you understand the shape my life was in. My husband was Gerald, 29 years together, and he was the kind of man who fixed the porch step before I ever mentioned it was loose. He went 11 years ago, quick and without warning, an aneurysm on an ordinary Sunday while he was watering the tomatoes. I learned that grief doesn't always give you time to brace for it. Sometimes it just turns the lights off mid-sentence. I remember the specific, stupid detail of it more than almost anything else from that year. The hose was still running in the yard when the ambulance came, and nobody thought to turn it off. And by the time anybody remembered, half the garden had flooded. For months afterward, I couldn't look at a hose coiled up in someone's yard without my chest going tight. After Gerald, the house got quiet in a way that has its own particular sound, or maybe its own particular silence. I'd come home from the library and stand in the front hall for a second before I even took my coat off, just listening to nothing, the way you check a wound to see if it still hurts. It always did. I kept his reading glasses on the nightstand for years longer than made any sense, because throwing them away felt like agreeing he wasn't coming back, and some stubborn, foolish part of me wasn't ready to agree to that yet. I thought that was the cruelest thing the world had left in it for me. I was wrong, because 4 years ago, I lost my younger brother, Michael, too. He and his wife passed away together in a small plane crash on the way back from a wedding in Asheville, a charter flight. Engine failure. No warning there either. He was 51. I got the call from a state trooper at 11 at night, and I remember every single word of that conversation, with a clarity I wish I didn't have. The particular flat, careful way the man's voice sounded, like he'd practiced saying it so it would hurt less, which it never does. And he left behind a boy, his son, my nephew, Eli. Eli was 9 when his parents died. He's 13 now. There was no other family close enough or willing enough to take him, and there was never a question in my mind about what came next. I drove to the courthouse inside a week and became his legal guardian. And that boy came to live with me in the house I'd shared with Gerald for almost 3 decades. I remember standing in the doorway of what used to be my sewing room, now suddenly a 9-year-old's bedroom, surrounded by boxes of a life I hadn't packed, thinking that grief doesn't ask permission before it rearranges your whole house. The two of us, a widowed librarian and a boy who'd lost both his parents in a single afternoon, figured out, slow and clumsy, how to build something out of what was left. Some nights, neither one of us said more than a handful of words to each other. We just existed in the same rooms, two people circling the same hole, learning by trial and error how close we could stand to it without falling in. So that's who was sitting across from Sam Whitfield in that booth. Not some hopeful woman looking for company. A tired widow raising a teenage boy who had stopped expecting good things a long while back, because every time hope showed up, it seemed to be standing next to a hearse. So when Sam apologized for not being what I expected, I didn't do what you're supposed to do. I didn't tell him not to be silly, or that he looked just fine. I told him the truth instead. Sam, I said, can I be honest with you? Because I think honest is going to serve us both better than polite. He looked up from that napkin, wary. Here's the truth about what I expected. Nothing. I stopped expecting anything good a long time ago. I'm 60 years old. I buried my husband 11 years back, and my brother 4 years back. And I'm raising my nephew because there wasn't anybody else standing in line to do it. I changed cardigans twice tonight, because I haven't had a reason to care what I look like in longer than I want to admit. I almost didn't come because I figured, what does a woman like me have left to offer anybody? I held his eyes. So when you sit down and apologize for not being what I was hoping for, all I can think is, Mister, you've got it backwards. I'm the one who isn't what anybody's hoping for anymore. We're two people the world quietly stopped expecting things from. And the honest truth is, sitting across from somebody who knows exactly what that feels like, that's the first time in 11 years I haven't felt like the only person left in the room. That was the thing that made Sam Whitfield go quiet. Not crying, not exactly, just a long stillness, his jaw working, his eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, like a man recalculating something he thought he already knew the answer to. Because I hadn't flattered him. I just sat down in the wreckage next to him and said, me too. When he could talk again, he told me he'd actually met Eli once, months back, when the fire department did a safety demonstration at the middle school. Quiet kid, he said. Stood at the back of the group, didn't ask a single question out loud, but he was the only one who came up after and asked me, real serious, whether smoke inhalation hurt worse than burning. I remember thinking that was a strange thing for a kid to want to know. And something in my chest went tight, because that was Michael's mind exactly. That same need to understand the worst of a thing, rather than look away from it. And here was a stranger who'd noticed it in my nephew, without knowing whose grief he was looking at. He's got a habit, I told Sam, because something about him made a woman want to talk more than she meant to. Every Sunday night, we sit on the porch, and he tells me one thing that went right that week, and one thing that's still sitting heavy on him. His dad used to do something like it with him, before. I kept it going because it was Michael's, and because it's the only time that boy tells me anything true. Sam was quiet a moment, then said, sounds like he's lucky to have you keeping it alive. And I looked down at my coffee and didn't trust myself to answer that one. We stayed in that booth until Dot started flipping chairs onto tables around us. He told me about his own road, a marriage that had ended amicably and then just sort of evaporated into politeness. The way some things don't break so much as quietly stop being true. 2 grown daughters who called on holidays and not much in between. Both of them living lives in cities he said he was proud of and didn't quite recognize anymore. 31 years pulling people out of burning buildings and then retiring into a quiet that he said felt less like peace and more like a room nobody had bothered to furnish. He'd taken to driving out to the old station some mornings just to sit in the parking lot, not going in, just sitting there with his coffee, because the silence of his own house had gotten to be more than he could sit inside of. I looked at him a moment, and then I said it straight to him. You spent 3 decades running into the worst night of other people's lives, Sam. You spent 31 years being the man everybody needed, and now you're sitting alone in a parking lot because the phone stopped ringing. That's not nothing. That's about the bravest thing I've ever heard a person describe so plainly. He didn't say anything back right away, just looked at me like he wasn't quite sure what to do with being seen that clearly by somebody he'd known for under an hour. I understood that silence completely. I'd done my own version of it, driving past the hospital where Gerald had been pronounced, not stopping, just needing to see the building was still standing, while nothing about my life felt ordinary at all anymore. When we got out to the parking lot, neither of us reached for the easy goodnight. He stood there with his keys in his hand, working up to something. "I should tell you," he said finally. "I almost didn't come tonight either. I had a whole speech ready about how it's fine. We tried, no hard feelings, in case you wanted out before we even ordered." I told him I'd noticed the napkin. He laughed, short and surprised, like the sound caught him off guard. "I'm not looking for somebody to fix," he said. "Good," I told him, "because I'm not in the business of fixing grown men. I'm asking if I can see you again. That's the whole ask." He looked at me a long moment, like he was deciding whether to trust that it really was that simple. And then he said, "All right, same time next week." And he said it the way a man commits to something he's a little afraid of, not the way he'd have said it, just to be polite. For about a month after that, life had a warmth in it I hadn't felt since before Gerald died. Sam and I took it slow on purpose. A walk along the creek one Saturday, where we talked about nothing important for 2 hours, and it felt like the most important conversation I'd had in a decade. An afternoon at my house where he and Eli ended up on the back porch taking apart an old lawnmower engine for no reason except that Eli wanted to know how it worked, and I stood at the kitchen window washing the same dish for 10 minutes just to keep watching them. One Saturday morning, a few weeks into all of it, Sam showed up unannounced to fix a wobbly porch railing I hadn't even gotten around to mentioning. He'd noticed it on his own the last time he'd left. I brought him out a glass of tea and sat on the steps to keep him company while he worked. Not really doing anything, just watching him measure and tighten and mutter at a stripped screw. And at some point I realized I was smiling, just sitting there in the morning sun, watching a man fix my railing, smiling without having decided to, the way you don't decide to breathe. It startled me a little, catching myself like that. I hadn't smiled at nothing in particular, just at the simple fact of a person being present and useful and unhurried in my life, in longer than I could put a number to. Sam glanced over, caught me at it, and just said, "What?" Not even really a question, half a smile of his own tugging at his mouth. I told him nothing, and went back inside to get him more tea, mostly so he wouldn't see my whole face just then. One Tuesday, Sam came by the library after his afternoon walk, just to see me on my break, and he found Eli at one of the back tables, stuck on a history essay, chewing the end of a pen like it had personally wronged him. Sam pulled out the chair across from him without asking and said, "Let me see what you've got." By the time they were done, Eli had a full page he was actually proud of, and he came up to the desk afterward and told me, quiet, like it was a secret. Sam's pretty smart for a fireman. I didn't correct him that Sam had been a captain, because the way Eli said fireman, like it was its own kind of magic word, felt like exactly the right amount of respect. He fixed my sticking back door not long after that, the way some men bring flowers, and when I thanked him, he just shrugged and said a door shouldn't fight you every time you want to get into your own house, like that was a basic rule of decency rather than a kindness. He sat through 2 of Eli's school projects, one on the water cycle, one a diorama of the Battle of Shiloh that took up half my dining room table, without once looking at his phone, asking real questions, the kind that made Eli sit up a little straighter when he answered. A few weeks after that, I was going through a closet looking for old paperwork and found one of Gerald's books instead, a worn Western he used to read on the porch every summer. The spine cracked from being opened 1,000 times. When Sam found me that evening, still a little red around the eyes, I showed it to him instead of trying to explain. He asked who Gerald had really been, beyond what I'd already told him, and listened without once looking like he was waiting for his turn to talk. When I finished, he said, "Thank you for telling me about him. I'd like to know who I'm trying to live up to." Most men, in my experience, want to compete with the dead, not be introduced to them properly. Sam wanted to be introduced. One evening, Sam showed up holding a casserole dish, looking faintly embarrassed by it. "I don't really cook," he admitted, setting it on my counter. "This is a recipe my late mother used to make. I called my daughter in Ohio and had her walk me through it over the phone twice. It was a chicken and rice dish, a little dry around the edges, clearly the work of a man more comfortable operating a fire hose than an oven. And it was, without question, one of the kindest things anyone had cooked for me in 11 years. I ate 2 helpings and told him it was perfect, and he knew I was being generous, and he let me be generous anyway, which told me something about the kind of man he was. And the night Eli, with great teenage solemnity, decided Sam needed to learn how to properly throw a curveball, the 2 of them were out in the side yard until it got too dark to see the ball, Sam's bad knee clearly aching by the way he favored it walking back inside, never once complaining, never once cutting the lesson short, because his nephew, not quite nephew, needed it to last. Eli called him Captain Sam, without thinking twice about it, the way you'd call somebody by whatever name fit, and neither of them stopped to remark on it. I stood on the porch, watching the 2 of them in the dusk, a grown man letting a grieving boy boss him around a backyard, and I had to go inside for a minute and stand at the sink before either of them saw my face. By the time 2 months had passed, it was Sam at our table on Sunday nights, listening in while Eli told us his one good thing and one heavy thing. Thanksgiving fell right in the middle of all that. I dreaded the holiday every year since Michael died, because the empty chairs always seemed louder around a full table than anywhere else. That year, Sam showed up at 9 in the morning with a turkey he'd already started prepping at his own place. At one point, reaching past him for the pepper, Eli said, without any pause at all, "Move over, you're hogging the stove, Sam." The exact same tone he'd have used on family he'd known his whole life. Sam moved over without comment, and I stood in the doorway watching the 2 of them, understanding that something had shifted in our house, so quietly that none of us had marked the day it happened. One Sunday, Eli's heavy thing was, "I can't picture Dad's face as clear as I used to." He said it staring at his hands, the way he does when he's trying not to look like it costs him anything. I told him that was normal, that the picture fades before the feeling does, and that didn't mean he loved his father any less. Sam didn't say anything. He just reached over and put his hand on the boy's shoulder for a second, and Eli let him, which told me more than any conversation could have. Later that night, after Eli had gone up to bed, Sam sat with me on the porch a long while in silence, and finally said, "I lost my own father young. Different kind of loss, but I remember exactly that feeling, grabbing for a face that keeps slipping further away every year, no matter how hard you try to hold on to it." It was the first time he'd told me something about himself that wasn't framed as a joke or a deflection, and I understood, sitting there in the dark with him, that whatever this was becoming, it had stopped being a kindness 2 strangers were doing each other, and started being something neither of us had a name for yet. I want you to hold on to that month, because 6 days after that, a man named Curtis Boyd came back into our lives, and he was going to test every promise I'd made. I hadn't heard Curtis's name in years. He was Eli's mother's younger brother, no blood relation to me or to Michael at all. Just a man who'd drifted in and out of the family's life twice a decade back when his sister was still alive, and who'd never once asked after Eli in the years since the crash took her. He called me on a Thursday, voice syrupy with concern, saying he'd been doing some thinking about his nephew and felt it was time he stepped up. I should have heard what was underneath that sentence right away. I didn't. Not fully. Not until my attorney called 2 weeks later to tell me Curtis had filed a petition asking the court to name him Eli's guardian. What Curtis had actually been thinking about, it turned out, had nothing to do with Eli. Michael had carried a life insurance policy through the fire department's pension association, a substantial one, payable to Eli's guardian to be used for his care and education until he turned 18. As Eli's guardian, I controlled how that money was spent, with the bank requiring an accounting every year. Curtis wanted to be the one controlling it instead. He showed up at the library 2 days after I got the news, leaning on the circulation desk in a way that made my part-time clerk go find something urgent to do in the back. "Ruth," he said, all warmth, "this doesn't have to be a fight. I'm just trying to do right by Michael's boy." I told him Michael's boy had been doing fine without him for 4 years and didn't need rescuing now. His smile thinned out. "I have rights as his uncle," he said. "Family is family." I told him family doesn't show up 4 years late asking about a policy number before it asks about the boy's middle name. He didn't have an answer for that, just turned and walked out past the returns cart, and I stood there with my hands shaking on the counter for a good 5 minutes after the door swung shut. He came back once more, about a week later, this time to my porch on a Sunday evening, and the warmth was gone from him entirely. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, no preamble, standing on my front step like he had every right to be there. "Courts favor blood, Ruth. You're not his mother. You're not even his father's wife. You're his aunt, and I'm his uncle. And a judge is going to look at that and wonder why a single old woman thinks she's better suited than family." I told him I didn't have to wonder what a judge would think, because I already knew what kind of man had spent 4 years silent and then showed up asking about a bank balance inside a week of learning there was one. His jaw tightened. "You'll regret making this ugly," he said, and turned to go. "Curtis," I called after him, and he stopped on the steps. "The only person who's made this ugly is you. I'm just the one who noticed." He didn't have anything to say back to that, and he didn't come around again after, not until the bank inquiry forced his hand. I didn't tell Sam right away. I didn't want to hand him a mess 3 months into something that still felt fragile. But he found me on my porch a few days later, staring at nothing, and he sat down beside me without a word, and after a while I told him everything. He listened all the way through without interrupting once, and when I finished he said, "We're going to need a list. I'm good at lists. Spent 31 years making sure a fire scene had every base covered before anybody went home." That was the moment I understood that whatever Sam Whitfield turned out to be in my life, he wasn't going anywhere on his own schedule. He was staying on mine. There was a night, not long after, when Eli asked Sam directly, with the bluntness only a 13-year-old can manage, "Are you going to leave too, if this gets hard?" The question hung in the kitchen like something with weight to it. Sam set down his coffee mug, slow and deliberate, looked Eli square in the eye, and said, "Son, I spent half my career walking into buildings everybody else was running out of. I don't know how to do the leaving part. Never learned it." Eli didn't say anything back, just nodded once and went back to his homework. But I saw something in his shoulders loosen that hadn't been loose in a long while. My attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia Reynolds, laid it out plainly. "A blood relative asking for guardianship isn't nothing," she said. "The court will take it seriously on its face. What we need is proof this isn't about the boy. If we can show financial motive ahead of familial concern, the calculus changes fast, because judges have seen this exact play before. The question is whether we can prove it or just suspect it." Proving it took patience, and it came together in pieces, the way these things do in a town small enough that everybody's cousin knows somebody. Eli mentioned, almost in passing one Sunday, that Uncle Curtis had called him directly, something Curtis had never once done in 4 years, and asked him, conversationally, whether he knew how much money his dad had left him. An 8-word question from a man who'd never called before. I wrote the date down, my hand shaking just slightly as I did it, because hearing that a man I barely trusted had gone straight to my grieving nephew with a question like that made something in me go cold in a way the legal papers hadn't managed to. A week later, The bank that administered the policy flagged an inquiry from Curtis's attorney requesting a breakdown of the fund's current balance and the conditions under which a new guardian could begin drawing against it for the boy's expenses, filed 11 days before Curtis's custody petition ever hit the court. Patricia built the timeline out of those 2 dates and didn't need much else. The math told its own story. He'd gone hunting for the number first, and only filed for the child once he liked what he found. Curtis tried one more time to get to Eli directly, showing up outside the middle school one afternoon at pickup, leaning against a car too nice for a man who'd never once sent a birthday card. He waved Eli over, all smiles, holding out a brand new phone still in its box. "Got you something, buddy? Figured a kid your age ought to have a good one." Eli stopped on the sidewalk, looked at the box, then looked back at the school doors where I was waiting at the curb. "I've got a phone," he said. "Flat. Not unkind. Just final. And I'm not your buddy. I don't even know you." He turned and walked straight to my car without another word, leaving Curtis standing there holding a phone nobody wanted, his smile curdling into something uglier before he caught himself and put it away. I watched the whole thing through my windshield, with my hands gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles ached. And I understood, watching my nephew walk toward me instead of toward that car, exactly how little that man's claim on him actually was. 2 nights before the hearing, Eli came and sat on the porch steps next to me, quiet for a long while, before he asked the question I'd been dreading. Is he going to take me? I told him the truth, because he'd had enough adults handle him gently with half-truths already in his short life. "Somebody's trying," I said. "But I am fighting it with everything I have, and so is Sam, and we are not losing you to a man who's never once asked your middle name." Eli was quiet, and then he said, so soft I almost missed it. I didn't even remember what Uncle Curtis looked like, which told me, more than any lawyer could, exactly how much claim that man actually had. I didn't sleep much those 2 nights. I'd lie awake running through every worst version of how it could go, picturing Eli packed into a stranger's car, picturing myself standing in an empty house for the second time in 11 years, this time with no Gerald and no Eli, and nothing left in it at all worth coming home to. I'd gotten so used to being the only steady thing in that boy's life that the thought of losing him felt less like fear and more like a kind of slow suffocation, the air going thin in a room I couldn't leave. One of those nights, I got up and stood in the doorway of Eli's room a long while, watching him sleep, that air mattress sagging under him the way it always did. And I let myself cry, the way I hadn't let myself cry in front of anyone since Michael's funeral. Quiet, doubled over, one hand pressed against the doorframe to hold myself up. I thought about every single thing I might have done differently, every form I might have filed wrong, every way a judge might look at a 60-year-old widow with a librarian's salary and decide it wasn't enough, decide I wasn't enough, and hand my brother's son over to a stranger with a nicer car and a thinner conscience. I stood there until my legs ached and the worst of it had passed through me, and then I went back to bed and lay there with my eyes open until the sun came up. Because some nights there isn't comfort to be had, there's just getting through to the other side of them. The night before the hearing, Sam showed up with a bucket of paint instead of his usual toolbox. "We're doing your spare room," he said, like it was already decided. "Eli's been sleeping on an air mattress in there for 4 years, like a guest in his own house. Win or lose tomorrow, that boy's getting a real room." We painted until well past midnight, and somewhere in the middle of it, rolling a second coat onto a wall the color of a summer sky, I caught him humming something low and off-key, and I stood there with a paintbrush in my hand and felt, for the first time in longer than I could measure, like I wasn't the only adult holding this family together by the strength of my own arms. Around 1 in the morning, sitting on the floor with our backs against the freshly painted wall, taking a break because neither of us could lift our arms above our heads anymore, Sam said quietly, "I know I'm not his father, Ruth. I know I'm not even officially anything to him yet. But I want you to know, whatever happens tomorrow, I'm not walking away from either one of you. Not now. Not if it gets harder than this." I didn't trust my voice to answer him right then, so I just leaned my head against his shoulder, both of us too tired and too scared and too in it together to need the words. The morning of the hearing, the courthouse smelled like floor wax and nerves. Eli held my hand so tight in the hallway that my fingers went numb. Curtis's attorney spoke first, talked about family bonds and a man's right to know his nephew. Patricia called exactly 2 witnesses. Eli's guidance counselor testified, plainly, that the boy's grades and attendance had only stabilized once he'd settled into a steady home. And she called me, briefly, to confirm the basic facts of the guardianship and the trust's accounting history, clean and unremarkable for 4 straight years. Then she introduced the bank's records herself, walking the court through them line by line, the date of Curtis's first call to Eli, the date of his attorney's inquiry to the fund, the date he filed. 11 days. She laid the documents in front of the judge without a flourish. Mr. Boyd didn't ask about his nephew for 4 years, she said. He asked about a balance, 11 days before he asked about a boy. Curtis's attorney objected, called it circumstantial, said grief makes people slow to reconnect, said a man shouldn't be punished in a court of law for being bad at expressing love. For a moment, watching the judge's face give nothing away, I felt the floor go uncertain under me, wondered if the dates alone would be enough, if circumstantial was a door wide enough for Curtis to walk through after all. Patricia didn't flinch. She simply repeated the timeline once more, slower, number by number, until the room went still enough that I could hear the clock on the wall. The judge looked at the dates a long moment and didn't say anything at all. Then the judge asked, gently, if Eli wanted to say anything, and my heart climbed into my throat. He walked up there himself, 13 years old, and steadier than I had any right to expect, and he said, "Everybody keeps calling this a custody thing, but it doesn't feel like that to me. It feels like people deciding where my home is." His eyes found Curtis for a second. "I don't really know you." Then they found me. But Aunt Ruth was there every single night, even when I didn't want to talk. And Sam taught me to throw a curveball, and he didn't have to. Nobody made him. His voice cracked just slightly on the last part. "I just don't want to leave the people who actually showed up." I didn't bother holding back my tears after that. The judge took a long pause before he spoke again, and when he ruled, it wasn't a close call. The petition was denied. He said plainly that a man who calls about a balance before he calls about a boy has already told the court everything it needs to know about his intentions. Curtis left the courthouse without a word to either of us. He moved out of state within a few months, and as far as I know, he's never reached out again. A year has passed since that morning. Eli's grown 2 inches and finally started filling out the way teenage boys do all at once. With Curtis's standing formally addressed by the court, Patricia helped me finish something I should have started years before. I filed to make the guardianship permanent and unchallengeable, securing Eli's place for good. When the judge asked him if he understood what that meant, he said, "It means nobody else gets to ask again." The judge nodded, like that was exactly the right way to put it. We had a small gathering after, just at the house, nothing fancy. Dot brought a cake she'd been baking since 6 that morning, and a few of Eli's friends from school came by, and Sam grilled too much chicken because he said a celebration without too much food wasn't a real celebration. I stood in my own kitchen that evening, watching my nephew laugh with his friends in the backyard, watching Sam flip burgers with a dish towel over his shoulder like he'd been doing it in that yard for years. And I thought about how strange it is that the worst year of your life and the best year of your life can sometimes be sitting right next to each other on the same calendar, close enough to touch. Sam's at the house most evenings now. He and Eli still tinker with anything that has an engine in it, and the boy calls him Captain Sam in front of strangers and just Sam at home, like he's sorted out which version belongs where. We still do the porch ritual every Sunday, one good thing and one heavy thing, and these days Sam's usually in the 3rd chair, not saying much, just there. A few weeks back, Eli's heavy thing was that a kid at school had asked him, Not unkindly, why he lived with his aunt instead of real parents. Before I could open my mouth, Eli answered it himself. I told him these are my real people, he said. Dad and Mum didn't get a choice about leaving, but Aunt Ruth and Sam didn't have to stay. They're staying anyway. That's better, not worse. 14 years old now, and he'd already understood something that takes most people a lifetime to learn, if they ever learn it at all. There are still hard nights. He still sometimes goes quiet around the anniversary, still sometimes asks questions about his parents that I don't have good answers for, and we don't rush him through any of it, because grief on a deadline isn't grief at all. It's just performance. But he laughs easily now, the kind of unguarded laugh I didn't hear out of him for the first 2 years he lived with me. He's got a library card he actually uses for things other than required reading, and a fire captain who taught him to throw a curveball and never once asked for anything in return, and an aunt who finally, stopped flinching every time the phone rang at an odd hour. A few weeks ago, the three of us were walking out of the hardware store, arms full of paint supplies for the next room Sam had decided needed fixing, when Eli stopped in the parking lot and looked at Sam for a long moment. "Hey," he said, "you're not going anywhere either, right?" Sam crouched down to his level, even though Eli's nearly as tall as him now, and said, "Not a chance, son." Eli nodded once, like that settled something he'd needed settled, and the three of us kept walking like nothing unusual had happened at all, though I had to look away and blink hard for a second. That night, after Eli had gone to bed, Sam and I sat out on the porch the way we do most evenings now, not saying much, just sitting in the kind of quiet that doesn't ache anymore. He reached over and took my hand, the way he's done 100 times by now, and said, "You know, Ruth, I spent 15 years after my divorce telling myself I'd already had my one good chapter, and the rest was just going to be filling pages until the book ended." He turned his coffee cup again, that same old habit. I was wrong about that. Turns out the best chapter hadn't even started yet. It was just waiting on the right two people to stop looking so hard and sit still long enough to find each other. I didn't have anything clever to say back to that. I just held onto his hand a little tighter and let the night sit there with us, warm and ordinary, and entirely, finally, enough. Every Wednesday, Sam and I still meet at Dots, same booth, same vinyl seats. He doesn't fold napkins into squares anymore. He doesn't rehearse apologies in his head before he sits down. Neither of us found exactly what we were hoping for that first night. We found something neither of us believed was still out there waiting on two people who'd already stopped looking. Two people with nobody left, who somehow, against every bit of sense either of us had left, found each other anyway, and found a boy who needed both of us at the exact same time we needed him right back. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Leave it in the comments. I read every one. And if you're new here, go ahead and subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming, and I think you'll want to be here for them.